Hi there, welcome to the UKEstuff podcast for part two of my interview with Jim Beloff, who was very gracious with his time, and so much so that I've decided to break up that interview into two parts. If you haven't heard part one, you'll want to go back and listen to it, and if you have listened to part one, here's part two. Speaking about recordings, real quick, The Legends of Ukulele with Rhino, is that still available and out there?
Well, again, no, absolutely
Okay.
not. It was a limited edition, and they made just so many, and that was the end of it. That doesn't mean you can't find it. Again, if you go to eBay, you can find copies of it, but it's out of print completely.
I was just like looking on Apple Music to see, because a lot of times they'll make things like collections available and I couldn't find it. This is probably a good spot for you to just mention about your Spotify playlist for the book. This would
Yeah.
probably fit in right there.
Oh, yeah. Well, thanks. Yeah. I mean, again, here is. Can you see this? Yeah. Here's
Yes.
the book, and in it, of course, I end up talking about just dozens and dozens and dozens of pieces of music, either mine or other people's music that moved me and that were part of these adventures. For example, my discovery of Lyle Ritz was a turning point. Hearing just the very opening track of his album How About You, and the song was Don't Get Around Much Anymore. I mean, by the time that song was over, I had come to the conclusion that everything I had ever thought about the ukulele was wrong. I had no idea that you could take this instrument where Lyle had taken it in the late 1950s on this album, and so it changed my entire, it changed the goal. The goalposts moved dramatically. I thought, my God, this instrument has so many more dimensions to it now, having just listened to this one song. So that's a long way of saying that that song is on the Spotify playlist too. So you can hear Lyle Ritz, and all of the music that I mentioned throughout the book is all the concertos are on the Spotify playlist. And George Harrison's story that I talk about, I included a song, I think, from George's album. And so all of those little those little alleyways and all the various music mentions where I could, I included it on this playlist.
In a very similar with Lyle Ritz, after reading your book, long story short, historically, Bach was completely forgotten about other than as a piano like tutorial book. And then Mendelssohn came along and said, this is pretty good stuff. And today we think of Bach as this mega, influence where he's nearly forgotten, right?
Right.
Lyle was nearly forgotten, except for in Hawaii, you mentioned. So you kind of helped bring him back. But how crazy is it that he had to subside as a bassist, and now he made a good living doing it, right? Paying for life as a bassist, but had to leave that ukulele basically for a long period of his life. I mean, he kept playing it, but another instrument became his focus. Just those are things that you read and you're like, what? Because we think of him in such a revered way today,
Right.
in the ukulele world. So it's again hard to believe that he is kind of, except for in Hawaii where they thought he was it, which makes sense because he really was.
Yeah, although there's a little bit of a nuance there because Lyle wasn't just a bass player. He wasn't just sort of a working bass player. He was, but he was also, one of the bass players of the Wrecking Crew. I mean,
Yeah.
he's playing acoustic bass on Good Vibrations. He played on some extraordinary, pop recordings. It's on the Righteous Brothers. You've Lost That Love and Feeling.
Yep.
Boom. I mean, that's Lyle on bass there. So I think that throughout his Wrecking Crew days, he was digging it. That was one of the coolest gigs to have for a studio musician, was to be part of the Wrecking Crew.
Now, I want to ask you some education questions real quick, and you can go deeper or narrow or even say, nah, whatever. But the first question is, did you ever consider a classroom method? Because you do have the ukulele tips and tunes, Did you ever consider making something for the classroom? Or is it just because at the time, I mean, the ukulele in classrooms is like only, well, I mean, you've got Doan method in Canada that goes back to the 50s and 60s, well, 60s for sure. But in the United States, the ukulele in the classroom, other than Hawaii, and even there, I hear, is in the past 15 years. So did you ever consider a classroom method?
No, not
Okay.
once.
All right. Second question. That makes a quick answer. You settled on C tuning by 1994, whereas in your earlier books, you published the tunings as they are originally published and let people just deal with the different chord shapes and just playing the different chords. Do you run into a lot of people that prefer the detuning that basically, it's, I hear the strong places for that are Canada and perhaps some places in England, perhaps that really rely on detuning. Do you run into that a lot? Do you get a lot of feedback from that or not much at all?
In the early days, and yes, you're right. It was especially in Canada, and I think that was the Doan influence, if I'm not mistaken. It's been a while, but I think that he found that the detuning, I could be wrong about this, and if so, I apologize, was maybe a better teaching key. I could be wrong about that. I think also that Chalmers, again, he was using the ukulele mostly as a teaching device. I think that he didn't do reentrant for that reason as well.
Yes.
But I apologize if I'm wrong about that. My understanding about the detuning mostly is that it was favored by vaudeville artists, in particular artists like Roy Smeck. And the reason that I always bought into was that you're dealing sort of at a time where electronics is either new or non-existent. And so if you were a vaudeville artist, you had to fill an auditorium with a very small instrument. And so by taking the uke up just one whole step, it makes it brighter and probably easier to hear. And so Smack was always playing in the key of D. And so so that was part of it. And yes, when we bought this stack of out-of-print songbooks at the very beginning, they came in every possible, literally song to song to song within a songbook, you were getting a variety of different tunings. I'm not quite sure at the time what they expected the player to do. Was it literally to, oh, now I have to change it and go, either up to the key of D or go down to some other key. But it, in retrospect, it's kind of crazy that to have a songbook that is featuring songs in a variety of tunings. And I didn't know better at the time. So that first, I sort of wince when I think about that first book, which is still in print and still sells. But right after that book came out, then I think that we did have a trip to Hawaii somewhere around 92, 93. And that's where I learned that Hawaii, at least, had settled for the most part on the key of C. And so I came away from that thinking, you know what, if Hawaii is comfortable with the key of C, then I am comfortable with the key of C. And so, at the time, it didn't seem like that big a deal. I just decided to do it. But I guess it turned out to be at least, part of a movement towards a standardized tuning, because prior to that, it was pretty all over the map.
Yeah, I traced method books all the way back down to 1910. Ernest I think was the first.
Right.
And that's in C tuning. And then it's not too much later, once Tin Pan Alley gets a hold of stuff, that you see a lot more stuff in the D tuning.
Yeah.
There's also a website out there. I'm not sure how legal it is. The guy's in Canada that sells a collection of scanned vintage music, and it's thousands of songs that he just covering his cost of like shipping and the materials. I think it's now on USB sticks that he sells it on, like the vintage uke or something on the website. But that kind of fascinates me. Now, you don't really consider yourself a teacher. You really don't. You do teaching, but you don't really consider yourself that. But you've had a couple pretty famous students. Is it Sam O'Neill?
Oh, Sam Neill.
Sam Neill, and then also Bette Midler.
Yeah.
As students. Now, my question for you isn't, one is, what are they like? But on the side of that, how do you teach them? What does that look like? What's your process with them? Without going super detailed, what do you do? So those are kind of my questions about the teaching.
I mean, when I think of myself think about teaching, I've been giving workshops forever. For 30 years, I've been giving workshops, mostly at UKFest, but also at music stores. And so I can't tell you, I mean, it's probably thousands of workshops. And so, um, eventually, what is it? Somebody said it's, what, 10,000 hours or something, and you get good at something. So I
Yes.
put myself in that category. Eventually, I got good at it, and I still feel like my advanced beginner workshop is pretty good. And I even did a DVD of that called Jumpin' Jim's Ukulele Workshop, and I still think it holds. One of the big revelations for me in teaching, and you mentioned it before we started to record, was that I realized that virtually everybody in a workshop played their G with their index, middle, and ring finger. And I knew that because that's how they'd learned it from the books. And in fact, even our Tips and Tunes book told you to make it that way. And I thought that was really interesting because at some point I had made, unconsciously, probably, I'm sure, not probably, definitely, I had unconsciously decided that it was smarter to make it with my middle, ring, and pinky. And so this is a long way of getting around to Bette Midler and Sam Neill. But these are a few of the things that I had observed over time and realized that finger placement, that especially beginners or new players can put too much emphasis on learning how to make chords with certain fingers. And so I felt it my duty, my responsibility over time to break people of that habit, not so much that it's all about the G chord or it's all about this chord. It's really to loosen people up about what fingers you use, because ultimately it's not about making this discrete chord. It's really about thinking about chords within a song and the movement between chords. And so if you think, for example, as I did, that a lot of the songs I like to play, these sort of Tin Pan Alley songs, oftentimes you would go from the major to the seven. Let's say when you're going into Hey Good Looking, when you're going into the bridge, and if you're in the key of C, you go from C to C7, which has a very distinct sound and feeling, and then you go to the bridge, which starts in F, right? And so it seemed to me that if that happens a lot, then you're oftentimes going to be going from a G chord to a G7, and if you're going to make it with your first three fingers, then you have to lift all three of them. Why not just lift your pinky and put down your index? And so from that little observation, I also realized that we all learned to make the C chord, the easiest chord of them all, with our ring finger. And then one day I'm looking down at my hand and I realize I'm not using my ring finger, I'm using my pinky. And so I like to say that my hand had overruled my head. And so I realized, well, why did it do that? I mean, if I didn't consciously make this decision, why did my hand put my pinky there? And it dawned on me that the reason is again, it's not a discrete chord. We're in motion here. And so if you play your C with your pinky, then you have three fingers to go to the next chord as opposed to two fingers if you're making it with your ring finger. And so those observations I thought were worthy to share with others. And so getting back to Bette Midler, probably, I shared a little bit of that, but mostly, when it comes to this instrument, it's mostly just sort of beating down whatever fear you have about learning a musical instrument. And the one thing that I learned early on was to teach people how to play a song in 1 minute. I made it sort of a thing. When we were at events, someone would eventually, especially early on, they'd come up, that's cute. And then they tell you, they see your books, they see your ukes, and they say, well, that's fun. And then, you've met these people before, I'm sure, Chris, these people who say, I don't have a musical bone in my body, and then they have the jokes like, the only thing I can play is the radio and that sort of stuff. And I would say, well, that's interesting. And then I would say, well, what if I could teach you to play a song in 1 minute? And most people say, all right, fine. So then I would teach them to play. He's got the whole world in his hands with the one finger making the C, and then the three fingers, the triangle, making the G7. And I could do that in 1 minute. And I loved thinking that all of these defenses in somebody's head that had been sort of, that had been manifest over decades, that, I'm not musical. I can never play a musical instrument. In 1 minute, you begin to see the unraveling of all of that. And then the next thing out of their mouths often was, well, how much is one of these things? Right? And so you could literally undo somebody's decades of convincing in 1 minute. And so that really was it. And so you start with a C and a G7, and you give a few other pointers, and mostly it's about confidence, right? And so, oh, well, I did that and I did that, and well, if that's it, then that's not too hard, and then they're off.
Now, did Bet have any previous guitar experience or anything to fall back on?
I think that she had tried the piano, like so many of us. I tried the piano. Yep. I just had a hard time with it, and so she had a hard time with it. And then I think she tried the guitar, and I my understanding was that didn't really take. And then finally, when her people contacted me, and I finally met her, it was sort of like, damn it, I'm from Hawaii. I should be able to play this instrument. And so I think I gave her 3 or 4 lessons, and she was off and running. And it was I tell the story about how, and it really is it is a wonderful story. The last lesson, I came over to her house, and she said, listen to this. And so right at the beginning, she starts to sing, With a Little Help from My Friends, the Beatles song. And she's making the chords, and she's singing the song. And so, of course, my first thought is, wow, I'm getting a private concert from Bette Midler, and she's singing, With a Little Help from My Friends. But more than that, it dawned on me that I was watching something that I had experienced and that we all have experienced. And that is that moment, that first moment that is pretty indelible in my mind. I still remember this. And I bet you a lot of the people that watch your show, and you might even remember this, that first time when you began to have enough facility that you could play chords in a row in some kind of tempo, and then sing above those chords. And there is this realization that you are actually making music. And I remember the very first song. I must have been about, 14 or 13 when I started on the guitar. And it was the Peter, Paul, and Mary song, 500 Miles.
Yep.
I remember 500 miles, 500 miles. And I thought, oh my God. It was really a sort of it was memorable enough that I still remember it. And I was watching her have that moment. And I thought, this is universal. This is the same experience we all have, the joy of making our own music.
There's that portable radio, right? The idea. A couple real quick questions about the Yellow Book and things. First of all, do you have any, when I watched you teach out of the Yellow Book at the LA Ukulele Festival, your strategy is much like they use in the Twin Cities, where you just recently were as well. I had a chance to see you teaching, which is great. I still need to buy the Lyle Light book, incidentally. That's one that I still have to buy. But you go over the chords first. You take a look at all the chords that are there, and then you go in and you just sort of roadmap what the song is going to do, and then you play. Do you have any other tips and tricks for people leading a uke group, following the Yellow Book or Blue Book, of what can facilitate that process any better, or is that pretty much a good summary?
Yeah, that's a perfectly fine summary. One thing with both of the books is that we established yet another rule when it came to the daily ukulele books, which is that you would never have to turn a page. So I never, because, what could be more annoying than, especially with 50 people, having to turn the page for the rest of the song. So yet again, on the Venn diagram, it not only had to be in a great, vocal range, it had to be in a good uke key, but it also had to be containable within 2 pages.
Yeah.
So that's where I became, I kind of learned, especially from my longtime editor, Ronnie Schiff, and then our engraver, Charlou, how to do what we call road mapping, which is basically learning how to take repeated sections and run them underneath each other. And in that way, you use less space, so that we can sometimes take songs that have multiple sections and be able to kind of squeeze them into a 2-page spread at the most. And so one of the things that I do find myself doing when I have daily ukulele jams is, before we go into it, to just sort of talk through what we call the roadmap. So in other words, you're going to do the first verse, you're going to go to the bridge, then you're going to go back to the top, then you're going to drop down to the coda, that sort of stuff.
Another similar question, Yellow Book, Blue Book, or any other arrangement, left-handers, you mentioned Ian Whitcomb and his influence. I can tell you mine real quickly. I let students choose whether they're going to play righty, lefty, or just flip it.
Right.
There's some people that get very angry at me about that, for giving them that choice, because goodness knows we don't have left-handed trumpets, and we don't have left-handed trombones. We don't have left-handed violins. So why should we have left-handed ukuleles, right? But I don't subscribe to that. How do you handle left-handers, or what advice do you give left-handers?
The other instrument that I often refer to when this comes up is the piano, right? I mean, it's not like there's a left-handed piano, right? And if you think about it, I mean, the way actually that I've considered this is that in some ways, right-handed people are using their dominant hand to often do the least remarkable work, right? I mean, especially when you're starting out, we're basically asking our dominant hand to just go up and down, right? The hard stuff is the left hand. We're moving all around with all these different chords. So in some ways, you could look at it and say, gee, if you're a lefty, you could be, you could really have sort of an advantage because you have all of this control on this side, whereas we, mostly have our greatest dominance is on our strumming hand. Now that can only go so far. And I don't have a strong opinion on it either way, whatever works, but I have seen all sorts of things. Ian, of course, turned there is a downside to being a lefty, which is that if you can only play left-handed, and if you come into a situation where there are only right-handed ukes, you're kind of out of luck. So for Ian, when he would come to anybody's house, he'd just take your uke and flip it around. And then, of course, I have met plenty of lefties who just play right-handed. It's not a big deal. And in that case, then I think of the piano, which is left-handed or right-handed. You're asking your hands oftentimes to do equally complicated things.
I'm going to ask you 3 instrument-related questions and one other question, and I'll get you out of here because you've been so kind with your time tonight. I appreciate it. The first question is, you had conversations with Martin and nothing ever came about. Did they not want to ever create a Jumpin' Jim's version of a Martin of some kind, or just that never happened? I don't know.
No, I never had that conversation with them, and it wasn't really top of mind. No, mostly my conversations with Chris Martin in the early days were, I think there's something happening here. Now, this is in the 90s. Right. We'd started to publish some songbooks. I think in 97, my history book comes out. So things are really starting, I think, to happen. And there's some articles coming out. And I remember introducing myself to him at the NAMM trade show, and he was perfectly lovely and polite. And of course had warm feelings towards the instrument because it had been so critical to the success of of Martin, at a very difficult time, way back. But no, I think he was enough of a businessman, and his nose told him that there just wasn't enough there, especially for a Martin, which that they're not just knocking instruments out; they're making really, really fine instruments. But it wasn't long before they put their toe in the water. I think it was called the SO uke, that a relatively inexpensive uke that they started to import, and then of course now they're fully into it. But that was all part of the struggle, and without struggle, oftentimes have a story or an adventure. And so anyway, and I have to say, getting Chris Martin's quote in the book, I did get some wonderful blurbs from some wonderful people.
Yes,
but I have to tell you that getting the one from Chris Martin was especially meaningful.
Now, Martin passing up on any sort of business thing led to the Magic Fluke. Is there anything you want to just mention quickly about the Magic? I mean, it has a reputation all of its own in the ukulele world. At one point, it was a very affordable ukulele. I'd say that thanks to inflation and being made in America, and also Chinese imports now left and right, it no longer has that reputation of being an inexpensive. Now, it's not uber expensive, but it's also not inexpensive anymore. But it has this reputation of being just a super playable, good sounding, rugged uke. Is there anything else you'd like to add about the Magic Fluke at all while I've got you on?
Well, there's so much to say. I mean, it is, my brother-in-law, Dale Webb, and my sister are completely intertwined in our story. And that was another reason why I wanted to write this book, because I wanted to tip my hat to them and to everyone else that we've partnered with throughout the years. But yes, I mean, he was the perfect guy. He had experience with molding, and he was a very experienced woodworker. And and he saw Liz and I sort of starting out tentatively publishing these songbooks and sort of feeling our way. And then he would hear me periodically say, it's one of the challenges with this early effort to build some steam for the instrument, that we were hitting a wall, because it wasn't easy to get instruments, right? You'd go to a music store in those days, in the early days, and either they had none or they had some imports that were just really unplayable. And then, the only good ones were really coming from, let's say, a Kamaka at the time, and Kamaka pretty much sold everything they made to the Hawaiian market. So I said there really is a need for something like this. And so in his own very quiet way, he started to fiddle, and ultimately came up with the Fluke, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Do you think that if you had been able to get the molds for the Macaferries, that you might have gone into business that direction?
It's anything is possible. We were sort of reaching for, we were grasping at straws, so to speak, thinking about how can we do this, and get sort of, go from 0 to 60 really fast. And we thought, and I had no experience in manufacturing, but Dale did. And so when we went to see Maria Macaferri, and I write about that too.
Yes, that's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, and she was so wonderful, and she's, it was very clear that chasing those molds was a dead end. Either they had been melted down or something, but anyway, it was not an option. And so, we learned pretty quickly that wasn't a direction we were going to go in.
Now, in your personal collection, I know you still have some Macaferries in it that you find fondly, but you said that your collecting days are over. I know your Magic Fluke is a regular player for you.
Oh yeah.
And I know you have a Martin at least that you keep playing. How much of your time do you spend on those instruments, and what would you say are your favorite instruments today, just as a quick summary?
Oh yeah, just that I do have a couple of standout collectibles, um, but for the most part, I love and still love the goofy novelty ones. So it's the Betty Boops and the cheerleaders and so the La Dominoes, all of those. And so when you come to our house, that's what I have on display, because those are the ones that just still charm me. And I know my collecting days are pretty much over, but were I to find yet another, some novelty one that I don't have, I'd probably jump on it. So
Now, talking about the history of the ukulele really quickly, you talk about, is it Madeira? Is that how you say it?
yeah, Madeira, right?
Madeira. You talk about a distinction between the machete and the bragina. What do you want to clarify that? Because I had always thought that they were interchangeable. Apparently, they're not. Do you want to address that real quick?
What I'd rather do is address. I think that I'm probably not equipped to give you a good clear answer on the difference between the machete and the bragina.
Okay.
But what I can do is explain the difference between the machete, which was a 4-stringed instrument, but the tuning wasn't quite like or wasn't even terribly close to the ukulele, the original ukulele tuning, and the rajau, which was a 5-stringed instrument, and that had the My Dog Has Fleas with an additional string. And so I think that and this is really mostly thanks to it's almost entirely thanks to the research of John King and Jim Tranquata. And I tip my hat to them and their book on the history of the instrument. They did this extraordinary research. And in fact, I write about this. John King really helped me with the second edition of my history book. And he kind of sorted this out for me, which is just that the rajau, the 5-stringed instrument, has as much to do with the modern day ukulele as the machete does, maybe more, because that's really where the tuning came from.
And the size more came from the machete, right? The size of it more came from the machete?
Maybe, yes. So,
yeah.
Right. So the size is more the machete and the tuning is more from the rajau. And when we went to Madeira a few years ago, we of course went looking for music, and we heard a band of folk singers, and there they were all playing rajaus. And I'm watching, and so they're all 5-stringed instruments, and I'm watching their fingers, and they're making all the standard chord fingerings that and so eventually they invited me to play along with them, and it took me 30 seconds to figure out what the other string did, and it was I dug it, and I understood. I saw how this 5-stringed instrument could have morphed into this 4-stringed ukulele.
The other thing that's really blown my mind recently is the Ukulele Friend website has this ukulele that they call a first ukulele that they date to 1879. And all the books that I'd read had said that it had been like a 5-year period of time or so after they arrived in Hawaii before they started making this new instrument. But it sure sounds like they started making them almost immediately out of what they had available. With the date of that one. So it's pretty cool. That's on the web. So if anybody wants to look up the ukulele website, he's got like a museum online that you can look at. And I would love to see that someday too. By the way, if we ever end up in where you're at, and I think you're in Massachusetts, right? Is that where you're at now, or is it Connecticut?
Connecticut.
If I ever get out there, a cup of coffee or the adult beverages on me, just so you know, if we ever do it. The final question really is when it comes to all your books and all your projects, what are you most proud of today? What do you look back as your lifetime achievement?
Well, there are a lot of different, as you say, as you said in the beginning, there are a lot of different chapters. The history book was pretty much the first one that had ever come out, and I was very thankful to be able to put that information in one place, and also a big tip of the hat to the art director on that book, Tommy Steele, and also Andy Engel, who made it look so fun, because I wanted to include all of these pictures of vintage ukes and memorabilia and ephemera, and then of course writing the two ukulele concertos was an extraordinary experience, and being able to perform the first one, You Can't Be Serious, with the original orchestra that commissioned it, the Wallingford Symphony here in Connecticut, and then the Michigan Philharmonic, and then being able to do it with a few different high school orchestras. It's been a thrill and a half. And writing this new book has been very deeply meaningful to me. But I think that the thing that that touches me the most, honestly, after all is said and done, is the Lyle Ritz books. I have a very deep I've very strong feelings for Lyle. He was a very special guy, and I know he got a number of people got to know him pretty well. Very humble, very funny, dry sense of humor, but not a natural marketing guy. Not very promotionally oriented, and at least for me, he was, and his work was what lit me up. And so without my discovering How About Uke, none of this would have happened. So hearing How About Uke changed everything, and then getting to know him, and then encouraging him to arrange songs, and then having him do it so beautifully. I hope that those books in particular just live on for a long, long time, because he wouldn't have done it on his own. It would not have happened. And he had a particular, and this, we could talk about this forever, but because he was a bass player, I have a theory about bass players who play the ukulele, which is that because the uke has no bass, if you understand root movement, it gives you a leg up over somebody else. And so his ability to hear chords, because in his mind, he's imagining the bass part, gives him some kind of special power. And so I feel like his arrangements in all three books are special, because not only who he was, and his aesthetics and the way he kind of liked music and the chords he liked, but also because he had this bass skill. And so I would say at the end of the day, I look at those three books and I smile a lot. And also we did 2 albums with Lyle. One was the live record with Herb Oda that I was very, very thankful to be able to put out, to capture the two of them playing jazz tunes in a club. And then Lyle's studio record that he did for us called No Frills, where he did the uke. He did it all on an Apple, on an iMac. He laid in all the uke parts in GarageBand, and then he laid in the bass parts. And he felt that record he was more satisfied with No Frills than any other record he'd ever made. And that in turn made me very happy that I could help him realize an album that because he was very fussy and he was very self-critical, very self-critical. And so for him to be able to say, yeah, I think I did a pretty good job on that, meant a great deal to me.
If somebody would want to play your concertos, how would they get the music for that? Is it available anywhere?
I would love that, because I'm the only one that's ever played it. And so finally, a couple of years ago, Tony Mizzen, who's done 3 classical books for me, he helped me notate it. And so now anybody who's interested, I have them available, and so all the music for the orchestra, of course, is all notated and available. But the one thing I had never done was to do all the musical notation and tabbing of the uke parts, and that's now done and available. So if anyone wants to perform it with an orchestra or a string quartet, let me know.
Well, I'm going to be contacting you about that, because I would like to learn that. I would like to take a look at it myself, and watch it as it goes and maybe learn it. Do you have any other music books or books in the works at this point that's coming up next?
No. But that doesn't mean that we're not thinking about it. But at the moment, no. This UKEtopia has been sort of a 3-year project, and I'm really happy that it's finally out, and I'll probably do what I can in my own limited way to promote it and get it out there. And as far as songbooks are concerned, it's not as if we're not open to the idea, but it just seems as if it's pretty much been done, and I'm not sure that there are many empty slots, which is a great thing. And so this is a golden era for people who want to play virtually anything on the instrument. Of course, they've got YouTube, so they don't necessarily need books. But I also feel like we've, especially with the Lyle Ritz books, with the classical books, Fred Sokolow did a blues book and a bluegrass book for us, and things like that. Those are terrific resources for people who want to expand into other genres. And then, of course, yes, I'm very thankful that the daily ukuleles have been still as popular as they are, especially with groups.
Do you have a quantity of the daily ukulele that's sold, or like a guesstimate of how many copies of that have sold?
I don't have it off the top of my head, but we did surpass 1 million copies in print of all our books.
Amazing.
It is amazing. I can't believe it myself.
I know I had talked to you when you were up in Minneapolis real quickly, and I'm sure you get the question all the time, like, is there going to be a third daily ukulele with like more of the music that the kids listen to? And I love your answer. It was sort of like, and you even say this in the book somewhere, where you're kind of like, I realized somewhere, was it the 80s, that you're like, this isn't my main music, and you're just not inspired by it. And sometimes it's hard to make things that you're not inspired to create.
It would be, I feel it would be very inauthentic for me to start arranging, Taylor Swift and, Lil Nas, and I don't know, Timberlake. that's not my era. And so I am more than happy to let another generation, tackle that material.
So we're not going to see a daily ukulele with Old Town Road in it.
I know.
Right? At the moment.
We've learned to never say never, but I would say that's as close to probably a never as there is.
I love that. Do you have any final things that you'd want to talk about or promote, or any messages? I know you're not a hidden person in the ukulele world. You're out there in a number of ways: ukulele magazines, festivals, interviews, you name it. But is there anything you'd like to promote, or any messages you'd like to share with the ukulele community following, especially the publication of, I guess it'd be a memoir, right? Is what we'd officially call it.
No, I don't really have anything, other than this book. Of course, I hope people will think about getting it. It's I hope they're entertained by it. It is a fun. I think it's a fun read anyway, and I tried to fill it with enough information that you can come away with a sense of having lived through this unique time in the history of the instrument. A lot of people may be coming to the instrument relatively recently. Like if you came to it in the last few years, you might wonder, how did this instrument come to be as popular as it is right now? And it's sort of interesting to know that it wasn't terribly popular. It was really unpopular for a while. In the late '80s, early '90s. I mean, the Beatles had a profound impact on the ukulele. The uke was really popular through the Arthur Godfrey era in the '50s, and then then it became guitar. And so it took quite a while for people to say, you know what, maybe it's time to take another look at this instrument. So no, I'm happy to promote this, the book, and beyond that, I just wish people, first of all, happy holidays and courage as we go through this difficult time. We're all hanging in there, and I guess maybe that we are fortunate to have this sweet little diversion in our lives, this instrument. For many people, even if it's over Zoom, or if you're going in wearing a mask with your uke club and there's just a handful of you and you're all socially distanced, the ability to go in and sing some songs together or play together, whether it's again through a Zoom or something else, I just feel as if more than ever, you can be grateful to have this little music box in your life at this moment.
That seemed like a perfect place to stop this interview. Jim and I talked a little bit further. Just I gave some of my personal experiences with the ukulele and how he had influenced me and made it possible for me to do what I'm doing today as a teacher, where I play ukulele as my main instrument, and for all the work that I do here on the Uke Stuff podcast, Uke Stuff channel, the Uke Playlongs channel, ukestuff.info. And really, again, Jim was the catalyst for all that through his work. So again, I'd like to thank him very, very much for his time. Very incredibly gracious to share a lot of time with me, and it's wonderful to be able to share that with you. I hope you have enjoyed this interview with Jim. I hope you go into 2022. This is being released on New Year's Day in 2022. I hope you go into this year with excitement and positivity and the ability to play that ukulele wherever you want it to be, because as Jim's wife Liz put it, uke can change the world, and it really can. All right, thanks again for listening and watching, and I'll be back soon with some more uke stuff for you.